Welcome to another episode of Gender Decoded. The first, so glad you're here. Whether you're commuting, walking your dog, or just relaxing, this is your space to explore the intersection of gender, data, and everything in between. I'm your host, and today we're diving into a fascinating global study that asks a surprisingly tricky question: can we really compare men and women's personalities across cultures? In this episode, we're going to explore a massive dataset involving over 830,000 people from 49 countries. The researchers used a well-known personality assessment called the IPIP-NEO, which breaks personality into 5 major domains like extroversion and neuroticism, and further into 30 specific facets. What makes this study different is that instead of assuming men and women interpret personality questions in the same way, the researchers tested that assumption directly. And guess what? It didn't always hold up.
Welcome to Gender Decoded, when numbers align, seeing the stories that data defines, breaking the barriers, truth untold, insights in gender, the data falls.
So here's what we'll cover. First, we'll look at the core idea of personality measurement and why comparing men and women globally isn't as simple as just comparing average scores. Then we'll break down how the study tested for measurement invariance, which basically asks, do men and women understand and respond to these questions in the same way? We'll explain what traits held up across countries and genders, which ones didn't, and why that matters. Then, we'll dig into 2 key visuals from the study that reveal some eye-opening global trends. And finally, we'll wrap up with what this all means for how we think about gender and personality. Let's rewind a bit for context. Over the years, research has shown that, on average, women score higher on traits like agreeableness, and men score higher on emotional stability. These findings have been reported again and again, from the US to Japan to Sweden. Some people have interpreted this as evidence of biological or innate psychological differences. Others say it reflects the roles society expects us to play, what's known as gender role socialization. But here's the problem. Most of those comparisons assume that a personality question like "I often feel anxious" means the same thing to everyone who reads it. That assumption is huge. If a man in Germany and a woman in Brazil read that question differently or relate it to different norms or expectations, their answers don't measure the same thing, even if they choose the same response. That brings us to the core of this study, testing for what's called measurement invariance. This is a fancy way of saying, are we measuring the same thing in both groups? If not, then comparing them might be like comparing apples to oranges. To test this, researchers used the IPIP-NEO personality inventory, which asks people about 30 specific traits like self-consciousness, trust, depression, assertiveness, and so on. The researchers analyzed responses from more than 830,000 people in 49 countries. They split the data by gender and looked at each facet of personality separately in each country. Then, they ran a series of statistical tests, confirmatory factor analyses, and multi-group CFAs to see whether the same traits were measured in the same way across men and women. They looked for 3 key types of invariance: configural, metric, and scalar. Scalar is the most stringent. It tells us if you can actually compare average scores across groups. Let's look at the data. The first chart shows a scatter plot. If men and women interpreted the trait the same way globally, we'd expect the point to fall along the diagonal. And many do, but some don't. Self-consciousness, assertiveness, and self-efficacy are the stars of the show. They fit well across both genders in almost all countries. But others like excitement-seeking, depression, and cheerfulness didn't show reliable structure in either gender anywhere. That's huge. It suggests we shouldn't treat all personality traits as globally comparable across genders. The second image is even more detailed. It's a matrix showing every trait on the y-axis and every country on the x-axis. Each little box tells you whether a specific trait reached the threshold for measurement invariance within that country. Solid boxes mean scalar invariance was achieved, so you can make meaningful comparisons between genders for that trait. Some rows, like self-consciousness, are almost solid across the board. Others, like depression, are practically blank. The implication is clear. Some traits can be compared cross-culturally between men and women, and others just can't. And this has nothing to do with how important or real the traits are. It's about whether the measurement works the same way. Now, here's the mind-blowing part. Overall, only about half of the traits held up when it came to structural equivalence, and just a third passed the highest level of measurement invariance across most countries. This tells us that many of the claims we've seen in popular books and headlines about men being more X or women being more Y may rest on shaky ground. Let's also bust a myth. This isn't just a problem of language or translation. The IPIP-NEO was administered in English in most places, so even among English speakers, there were differences. It's also not just about sample size. Countries with bigger samples didn't necessarily show better model fit. That means the differences may reflect deeper cultural interpretations, gender norms, or even how people self-reflect based on societal expectations. All right, let's pull it all together. Today we unpacked a massive study testing whether men and women understand and respond to personality tests in the same way across cultures. We learned that not all traits are created equal. Some are stable across genders and cultures, while others are not. This means that making gender comparisons in personality is a lot more complicated than just running the numbers. The takeaway? Be skeptical of sweeping claims about men and women's psychological differences unless the research has checked for measurement invariance. Because if we're not measuring the same thing, we're not really comparing anything at all. At the same time, for traits like self-consciousness, assertiveness, or self-efficacy, the data suggests we can make meaningful global comparisons between genders. Those traits pass the test, literally. So, next time you hear that men are less anxious or women are more agreeable, ask, was the tool valid across genders? Did the researchers test for invariance? And if not, take it with a grain of salt. That's it for this episode of Gender Decoded. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of personality and gender, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And if you're curious about any specific traits or want us to explore other gender-related topics, send them my way. Until next time, keep decoding the data and never stop asking the big questions.